Living alone doesn't usually begin with loneliness. It begins with something quieter and almost reasonable. A sense that life has simply slowed down and rearranged.
That fewer interruptions mean fewer complications, and that independence still feels familiar enough to trust. At first, there's nothing unsettling about the calm, it even feels deserved, like a natural phase after years of responsibility and noise, and that's why no one questions it, not the people on the outside and not the one living inside it. Days pass cleanly and predictably, without much friction, and predictability can feel like peace when nothing seems to require attention, yet there's a strange detail most people overlook: nothing feels wrong, and that's precisely what makes it harder to notice when something eventually is. Somewhere within that calm, a question begins to form, not urgently, not insistently, but persistently. What would happen if an ordinary day didn't unfold the way it usually does? Not a crisis, not an emergency, just a small interruption that depended on someone else noticing. The question doesn't create fear right away, because most ordinary days continue exactly as expected, and each uneventful day quietly trains everyone involved to trust the silence. This is where the shift happens, not emotionally but structurally, as routines begin to replace contact, and self-sufficiency begins to replace visibility, not because distance was chosen, but because nothing seemed to require closeness anymore. The house runs smoothly, the days manage themselves, and "I'm fine" becomes less of a reassurance and more of a system, a way of keeping life efficient and uninterrupted. Over time, that efficiency changes how absence is interpreted. Silence stops feeling like something to check on and starts feeling like confirmation that all is well. And here is the turn most people miss while it's happening: the danger isn't that no one cares, it's that care has quietly been downgraded into assumption, and assumption feels responsible enough that no one thinks to question it. When concern is replaced by trust, attention doesn't vanish dramatically, it thins, and thinning is far harder to notice than loss. Ordinary days continue to stack up, and with each one, the margin for being noticed narrows, not because risk suddenly increases, but because expectation steadily decreases. Being capable becomes the evidence used to look away, and calm becomes the signal that nothing needs to be checked twice. This is the moment when loneliness changes shape, when it stops being an emotion and starts becoming a condition, something built into the rhythm of life rather than a response to it. Everything still looks stable, functional, and harmless from the outside, and that appearance is convincing enough that no one feels urgency, including the person living inside it. That's why this story doesn't begin with sadness or crisis, it begins with normal life continuing smoothly, because when loneliness is mistaken for stability, the warning signs don't disappear, they simply stop interrupting, and what doesn't interrupt is rarely addressed until it finally does. What makes this phase so easy to miss is that life continues to function well enough to discourage concern, the house remains orderly, the days predictable, and predictability still passes for peace when nothing appears to be asking for attention. Certain rooms are used less, certain habits quietly fade, and none of it feels like loss because nothing has been taken yet, it all feels practical, even sensible. Time begins to repeat itself, mornings start the same way, evenings resolve without urgency, and repetition slowly becomes a form of comfort. Communication still exists, messages still arrive, just not often enough to interrupt the rhythm, and interruption starts to feel unnecessary, even inconvenient. Meals become simpler, effort more selective, not because energy is gone, but because effort no longer seems to change anything. All of this looks like adjustment, and adjustment looks responsible. But there's a moment hidden inside this calm that rarely gets named, the moment when normal stops being neutral, because the accumulation of these small efficiencies begins to remove something essential: margin. With fewer interruptions, alertness softens, with fewer reasons to prepare, recovery time quietly shrinks, and without regular checking, readiness erodes without being missed. Here's the uneasy part most people don't like to sit with: nothing feels wrong, yet the room for something to go wrong is getting smaller. This isn't decline, it's narrowing, and narrowing is difficult to notice because everything still works, just within tighter limits. Small health hesitations come and go without comparison, moments of forgetfulness feel harmless when no one is present to notice repetition, and pride fills the silence by insisting independence is intact. From the outside, this looks like resilience, but inside it subtly changes how risk is absorbed, because when routine carries everything, there's no buffer left for surprise. Stability becomes persuasive enough that concern keeps getting postponed, and postponed concern has a habit of arriving late. This is how quiet stops being just an environment and starts becoming a condition, one that trains everyone involved to expect consistency and overlook deviation until deviation can no longer be overlooked. Nothing dramatic has happened yet, and that's precisely why this stage lasts, because without urgency, attention always feels like it can wait. But there is a threshold here, a narrow point most people don't realize they've crossed until after, when the same calm that once felt safe begins to delay response instead of supporting it, and by the time someone finally thinks to look closer, they're no longer checking in on stability, they're checking to see whether everything they assumed was holding is still there at all. There is a sentence that sounds reassuring but quietly changes the direction of everything, a sentence so familiar it rarely raises concern, yet powerful enough to delay attention again and again, and that sentence is, "I'm fine." It's said lightly, often sincerely, and almost always with good intentions, because it keeps conversations simple and spares others worry, but over time it does something far more consequential than it appears. "I'm fine" becomes a filter, deciding what information is allowed to pass through and what gets quietly held back, and once that filter is in place, help doesn't just arrive less often, it stops being invited. At first, the sentence is accurate enough, things are manageable, nothing feels urgent, and repeating it feels responsible, even considerate, but repetition has a way of changing meaning. Each time "I'm fine" is offered, it reinforces a shared understanding that nothing requires follow-up, and that understanding settles in comfortably on both sides. This is where denial takes a different shape, not emotional denial, but functional denial, the kind that doesn't reject reality outright but edits it down to what feels acceptable to share. Small difficulties are reframed as minor inconveniences, pauses are described as rest, hesitation is dismissed as nothing worth mentioning, and the habit of smoothing things over becomes so automatic that it's no longer experienced as withholding, just normal conversation. What makes this dangerous is how cooperative it feels, because everyone involved is participating in good faith, trusting that important things will be said when they matter, and trusting that silence means stability. Over time, "I'm fine" starts doing more work than it should, it becomes proof that checking in isn't necessary, that concern would be intrusive, that life is under control without supervision. This is the moment when help doesn't just get delayed, it gets rerouted, because attention follows expressed need, and expressed need has been quietly removed from the system. The sentence simplifies interactions, but it also simplifies expectations, and once expectations lower, absence feels justified rather than alarming. Here's the uncomfortable turn that often goes unnoticed: "I'm fine" doesn't just reassure others, it convinces the person saying it to stop monitoring themselves as closely, because admitting struggle, even internally, starts to feel inconsistent with the story being told. The line between coping and concealing blurs, and that blur makes it harder to recognize when coping quietly becomes compensating. Minor adjustments multiply, doing a little less here, postponing something there, telling oneself it's temporary, and without realizing it, life begins to operate on reduced signals. From the outside, this looks like independence maintained, dignity intact, strength proven, but inside, it narrows the channels through which concern could ever arrive. The most unsettling part is that "I'm fine" often remains true until it suddenly isn't, and when that shift happens, there's no established habit of saying otherwise. The sentence has trained everyone involved, including the speaker, to expect that no update is needed, and expectations, once set, are slow to change. This is how denial becomes structural, not by rejecting help, but by making help unnecessary in theory and therefore unavailable in practice. Silence, supported by reassurance, becomes convincing enough that no one feels irresponsible for believing it. And yet, each unchallenged "I'm fine" quietly reduces the chance that someone will ask the second question, the one that actually reveals what's changing beneath the surface. By the time that second question would matter most, it often doesn't come, not because people don't care, but because they've been carefully taught that nothing is wrong. This is the quiet power of a harmless sentence repeated over time. It doesn't cause harm directly, it simply delays response long enough that when reality finally demands attention, the pathways for noticing have already been thinned, and the reassurance that once kept everyone calm becomes the very reason no one saw the shift until it could no longer be smoothed over. There comes a point when the world doesn't disappear, it simply moves at a distance, close enough to be seen but far enough to no longer require participation, and that distance settles in so gradually it feels almost intentional. Life continues outside, routines unfold elsewhere, schedules fill up for other people, and from where you stand, everything looks intact, just slightly out of reach. This is not isolation in the dramatic sense, it's something quieter, the feeling of being present without being needed, of existing without being expected. Days are no longer shaped by what must be done next, but by what can be observed without consequence, and observation begins to replace involvement without ever being chosen outright. At first, this feels peaceful, even freeing, because there's no pressure to keep up, no urgency to respond, no role that demands energy, and relief can masquerade as contentment when responsibility finally loosens its grip. But something subtle changes when participation fades, the sense of relevance begins to thin, and relevance is harder to notice when it's leaving than when it's gone. The world doesn't push back when attention is withdrawn, it simply keeps going, and that's the part that feels slightly wrong once it's noticed. Conversations become updates rather than exchanges, plans are heard about rather than made together, and events are something that happens somewhere else, to someone else, without needing comment. This distance is rarely challenged because it doesn't hurt sharply, it dulls slowly, and dullness is easier to live with than pain. But here's the moment where meaning quietly shifts, when watching replaces doing often enough that it begins to feel like a role instead of a phase. Being an observer feels harmless, until it starts shaping identity, until involvement feels optional and optional starts feeling unnecessary. This is where time takes on a different quality, not rushed, not pressured, but stretched thin, as though there's plenty of it and nowhere specific it needs to go. The days fill themselves, but they don't lead anywhere, and direction fades without resistance. What's unsettling is that none of this feels like rejection, because no one has pushed anyone away, and that absence of conflict makes it harder to question. Distance built without disagreement feels natural, justified even, and that's why it lasts. The quiet turn here is easy to miss. When life is mostly observed, it becomes harder to tell when something requires response, because observers aren't expected to act. Attention becomes passive, and passivity slowly erodes readiness. Small changes are noticed but not addressed, moments pass without being marked, and concern stays abstract because there's no clear signal to convert it into action. From the outside, this looks like calm acceptance, like someone who has adjusted well, but adjustment has a cost when it removes expectation. The absence of expectation lowers the likelihood of interruption, and interruption is often what brings closeness back before distance hardens. Over time, being on the sidelines stops feeling temporary and starts feeling assumed, and assumptions are powerful because they don't ask permission. This is how life can continue happening in full view without including the person watching it, not through exclusion, but through momentum. And once momentum carries things far enough, re-entering becomes harder, because it requires disrupting a pattern that has already been labeled stable. This is not the end of connection yet, but it is a narrowing of it, a stage where involvement hasn't vanished, but it has thinned enough that absence would no longer feel immediately alarming. The danger isn't that nothing is happening, it's that everything important appears to be happening somewhere else, and when that becomes the normal view, the line between being part of life and merely witnessing it grows faint enough that crossing back over no longer feels automatic, it feels like something that would need explaining. The shift doesn't announce itself with a crisis. It shows up the first time something specific happens, something small enough to be excused, but concrete enough to matter. A call that usually gets answered by the second ring goes to voicemail and stays there. Not all day. Just long enough to notice. An evening check-in that's never been skipped doesn't come, and the silence stretches past the hour when it normally would have arrived. Nothing dramatic replaces it. No bad news. Just absence where routine used to be. At first, the mind does what it has been trained to do, it explains it away. They must be busy. The phone is probably charging in another room. There's no reason to overreact, because nothing like this has ever meant anything before. That logic feels responsible. Calm. Mature. And that's exactly why no one interrupts it. Time passes without being challenged, and the moment quietly resets itself as normal. When contact finally happens, the relief is immediate, but that relief lands a little too cleanly. It closes the gap before anyone has to ask why the gap existed at all. The system exhales, and with that exhale, a lesson is learned: delays are survivable. No harm came of it. Nothing needed to change. What goes unnoticed is that something already has. The absence didn't trigger concern, it triggered patience. And patience replaces reflex faster than people realize. The next delay doesn't feel like a first anymore, it feels like a variation. Checking in starts to feel optional rather than automatic, because experience has now proven that waiting works. This is where the danger hides, not in neglect, but in success. The system handled the delay without consequence, so it adjusts itself to expect more of the same. What should have felt slightly wrong instead gets filed as acceptable. Over time, that filing changes behavior on both sides. Response is slow because urgency no longer feels justified. Signals get softened because there's no desire to create unnecessary worry. Everyone is trying to be reasonable, and in doing so, they remove the very friction that once brought attention early. This is the point where help doesn't stop existing, it just starts arriving later than it used to. Later not because anyone chose delay, but because the structure that once made immediacy natural has been quietly dismantled. What's unsettling is how invisible this transition is while it's happening. No single moment looks serious enough to name. Each pause is defensible on its own. But together, they retrain expectations about timing, about thresholds, about when concern is allowed to activate. The person inside this pattern often feels the shift first, not as fear, but as adjustment, learning when it's better to wait, when it's better not to bother, when it's better to stay within what has already proven manageable. That adaptation looks like independence from the outside. Inside, it's something else, a recognition that support now requires a clearer signal than before. And that recognition quietly raises the cost of being noticed early. Nothing has gone wrong yet, and that's exactly why the system feels safe continuing this way. But safety that depends on nothing unexpected happening is thinner than it appears, because it means the moment something finally does require immediate attention, it will be arriving into a structure that has already practiced waiting. By the time anyone senses that something is different, the difference has already been rehearsed quietly. Waiting no longer feels like hesitation, it feels like the correct, respectful response. A call goes unanswered and the first thought isn't concern, it's timing. They're probably resting. They're usually fine. I'll try again later. Nothing about that thought feels careless. In fact, it feels mature. Experience has taught everyone involved that urgency has rarely been required. The arrangement has been rewarded by calm outcomes again and again, and so the body no longer leans forward when silence appears, it leans back. Attention loosens, not because it fades, but because it has learned that nothing bad usually follows. This is the moment the pattern quietly flips without anyone announcing it. Concern used to initiate action, and reassurance came afterward. Now reassurance arrives first, and concern is delayed until it can be justified. And that justification keeps drifting further away. What once would have triggered movement now triggers observation. People wait for confirmation before reacting, without noticing that confirmation can only arrive after time has already passed. The lack of alarms becomes its own permission slip to stay still. Here's the subtle shift most people miss: responsibility doesn't disappear, it relocates. The burden of signaling quietly moves from those watching to the one living alone. Silence is no longer interpreted as a possible warning, it's interpreted as neutrality. If something were wrong, surely they'd say something. If they needed help, surely they'd reach out. That assumption sounds respectful. It sounds like trust. But it also means concern no longer activates unless the signal is strong enough, unmistakable enough, disruptive enough. Small signs don't travel well through a pattern trained to wait. And sometimes, the waiting has a shape. A phone lights up late in the evening. Someone notices it, considers calling back, then checks the time and decides it can wait until morning. Another message sits unread a little longer than usual, but it's dismissed, they're probably asleep, or busy, or just having a quiet day. Each decision feels reasonable. Each one is made in isolation. No single moment feels like a mistake. That's what makes them dangerous together. Over time, even the watchers stop noticing how much they're postponing. Delays stretch because there's no internal clock pushing back anymore. Follow-ups soften. Check-ins become casual, easy to reschedule. No one marks the moment when response stops being reflex and starts requiring intention, but intention is always easier to defer than instinct. What looks like flexibility on the surface is actually a loss of pressure underneath. At the center of all this, the person living alone doesn't experience it as neglect. They experience it as calibration. They learn which details are worth sharing and which aren't. They learn how much inconvenience is acceptable to mention. They notice that small concerns are often met with reassurance rather than response, so they stop offering them, not out of pride, but efficiency. There's no point creating worry if nothing will change. Gradually, they stop expecting immediacy at all. Waiting becomes mutual, unspoken, normal. This is the quiet danger of systems that work too smoothly. Because nothing breaks, no one intervenes. Because everyone is reasonable, no one presses. The absence of friction creates the illusion of stability, even as reaction time thins. The pattern doesn't collapse, it optimizes itself for calm. And calm, once practiced enough, begins to feel like proof that everything is fine. The unsettling truth isn't that no one would respond if something truly went wrong. It's that, truly, keeps getting defined later and later. By the time concern finally outruns reassurance, the earliest window has already closed. Nothing dramatic announces that moment. No alarm sounds. There's just a quiet realization afterward that waiting felt responsible right up until it mattered. There is a moment that can never be identified while it's happening, only afterward. Not because it's dramatic, but because it looks almost identical to the calm moments that came before it. Nothing announces itself. Nothing demands urgency. And that is precisely why it cannot be undone. Later, people will point back and say, that was probably it, without realizing that by the time something can be named, it has already changed what's possible. What shifts here isn't the situation, it's the meaning of delay. A response takes longer than usual, but not long enough to justify alarm. A voicemail is heard late in the evening, noticed, and left unanswered because waiting until morning feels reasonable. It isn't forgotten. It isn't ignored. It's postponed. And in this moment, postponement quietly stops being neutral. Nothing bad happens immediately, which is what allows the pattern to settle instead of breaking. From this point on, the danger isn't confusion. It's confidence. Confidence that patience is still appropriate. Confidence that calm still means safety. Confidence that if something truly required action, it would be clearer by now. That confidence feels responsible. It prevents panic. It protects dignity. But it also overrides instinct. The body registers a slight wrongness, and the mind corrects it. Not once, but repeatedly. And each correction makes the next one easier. At the center, the person living alone adjusts without realizing what they're responding to. They notice the spacing between contact widen. They feel concern arrive more cautiously, more politely. They don't interpret this as withdrawal, they interpret it as normal. So they adapt. They wait a little longer before mentioning things. They let small issues resolve themselves. They don't want to create urgency where calm seems expected. What they don't see is that every quiet adjustment reduces the chance of being interrupted early. This is where almost becomes irreversible. Almost calling back sooner. Almost checking again before bed. Almost trusting the sense that said, don't wait this time. Almost don't feel dangerous when they occur. They feel reasonable. But they narrow the future without announcing that they're doing so. Each one quietly closes a window that will not reopen, no matter how much care appears later. This is the line most people misunderstand afterward. They believe the loss, if it comes, begins with a crisis. It doesn't. It begins here, when waiting stops being flexible and starts shaping outcomes. From this point forward, responses can still happen. care can still arrive. But they will arrive into a smaller space, with fewer options, and no way to recover the time that patients already spent. Because after this moment, even the right response can no longer restore the original margin. It can only deal with what remains. What disappears now isn't care or attention. It's space. The extra room that once absorbed small delays without consequence has quietly collapsed. Nothing looks broken. Messages still get answered. Calls still come back. People still mean well. But everything now happens closer to the edge, and edges don't behave the way open ground does. They don't forgive hesitation. They don't allow for recovery to feel normal. From here on, timing doesn't stretch to meet intention. Intention has to move immediately, or it arrives late. This is why the next phase feels wrong in a way that's hard to explain. People do the right things, and still feel uneasy afterward. A check-in happens, but it doesn't bring relief. A response arrives, but it lands heavy instead of reassuring. Nothing is technically too late, yet nothing feels early anymore. The comfort that used to follow action doesn't show up. There's a sense that everything now carries weight it didn't used to carry. Small things start behaving differently. A delay that once cost nothing now costs energy. A missed moment requires effort to recover from. Ordinary disruptions linger instead of clearing. And no one can quite say why. From the outside, it still looks like normal life continuing. From the inside, it feels tighter. Less forgiving. As if the system has stopped buffering mistakes and has begun recording them. For the person living alone, this is where the body starts compensating before the mind catches up. Energy gets rationed. Non-essential effort is postponed. Discomfort is measured before it's mentioned. Not because anything is wrong, but because everything takes more out of them than it used to. The space to bounce back quietly isn't there anymore. So they adjust. An adjustment, here, doesn't restore balance. It preserves function while narrowing options. What makes this stage dangerous is that everyone else still believes there's room. They assume time will soften things the way it always has. They act with patience, with restraint, with respect, and don't notice that patience now has a cost. Each delay compounds instead of dissolving. Each, it can wait, removes another margin that won't return. No one feels careless. No one feels neglectful. And yet the floor is closer than it appears. This is where doing the right thing starts to feel wrong. Not morally, structurally. Responses still happen, but they arrive into a space that can no longer absorb them easily. Concern doesn't calm, it stabilizes. Reassurance doesn't relieve, it contains. Action doesn't restore safety, it holds things in place. And holding something in place is very different from preventing it from falling. From here on, nothing dramatic is required. The pattern no longer needs a mistake. It only needs continuation. The same waiting. The same assumptions. The same belief that calm equals control. Coincidence used to protect the system. Now there's no room left for coincidence to help. What comes next won't announce itself as a crisis. It will arrive as something that could have been smaller, if it had come earlier. The next change doesn't feel like failure. It feels like effort. People begin doing more, not because they're alarmed, but because something no longer feels settled. Check-ins become more frequent. Questions carry a little more concern. Schedules adjust. Attention sharpens. From the outside, this looks like responsibility activating at the right time. From the inside, it feels strangely insufficient. The actions are correct, but they don't produce the calm they used to. Relief doesn't arrive with them anymore. This is the stage where timing reveals itself as the missing piece. Help shows up, but it shows up into a situation that has already shifted. What once would have simplified things now only stabilizes them. Conversations circle instead of resolve. Support reduces risk, but doesn't remove it. People sense that they're responding to something already in motion, even if they can't name what that something is. There's a quiet awareness that the system is no longer ahead of the problem, it's alongside it. What makes this moment unsettling is how reasonable everything still feels. No one panicked too late. No one ignored clear warnings. Everyone acted according to the information they had. And yet the outcome carries weight that doesn't match the effort. The same care applied earlier would have felt decisive. Applied now, it feels managing, containing, holding steady rather than turning things around. That difference isn't obvious in real time, it's felt as a subtle frustration that no one wants to admit. For the person living alone, this is when outside attention becomes noticeable and oddly tiring. There are more questions to answer, more reassurance to provide, more explanations for why something that feels manageable still feels heavy. They sense concern, but it arrives layered with catch-up. Support feels reactive rather than preventative. Even kindness carries a hint of urgency that wasn't there before. And urgency, when it arrives late, doesn't feel protective, it feels demanding. This is where the system begins to show strain without breaking. People adjust again. They compensate. They fill gaps manually that margin used to handle automatically. They double-check. They follow up. They worry quietly. Everything becomes slightly more effortful, slightly less fluid. No single task is overwhelming, but together they create a background pressure that didn't exist before. The calm hasn't vanished. It's just working harder to hold itself together. Here's the uncomfortable truth that emerges at this stage: the window for easy correction has closed. Not the window for care, that remains. Not the window for response, that's still open. But the window where small actions produce large relief is gone. From now on, effort and outcome are no longer proportional. More energy is required to achieve the same stability, and even then, stability feels temporary. This is why people often misread this phase. They think the problem is insufficient effort. So they add more. More calls. More reminders. More planning. But the issue isn't effort, it's timing. Effort applied after margin disappears behaves differently. It slows decline, but it doesn't reverse it. And because slowing decline feels like progress, the deeper loss goes unnoticed. Nothing here looks like a crisis yet. That's what keeps the pattern intact. Things are handled. Days continue. Plans remain. But something important has shifted quietly. The system is no longer preventing outcomes, it's preparing for them. And preparation, no matter how careful, is not the same as protection. By this point, even if everything stabilizes, it won't stabilize lightly. There will always be a sense that things could tip. That vigilance is required. That absence now carries more meaning than presence once did. Help has arrived, but it has arrived into a narrower space, where every response must work harder just to keep things from worsening. What comes next won't feel sudden. It will feel like the moment people realize they've been responding, not leading, for longer than they thought. What makes this part difficult to recognize is how ordinary it feels. There is no crisis. No phone call that demands immediate action. No dramatic change in routine. The day unfolds the way most days do, quietly, predictably, without interruption. And that's precisely why it matters. Because by now, the system is operating so close to its limits that an ordinary day carries more weight than it used to. Everything that happens feels acceptable. Messages are exchanged. A brief update is given. Someone thinks about checking in later and feels satisfied that things seem fine for now. No alarms go off, and that absence feels like confirmation. But what's actually happening is more subtle. There is no slack left. Nothing absorbs delay anymore. The system is no longer forgiving enough to treat normal variation as harmless. This is where the danger becomes invisible even to people who are paying attention. Because attention still works, it's just late. People are watching. They are aware. They are involved. But awareness now trails events instead of preceding them. Concern follows signs rather than anticipating them. And because nothing unusual presents itself, no one feels justified breaking the pattern that has been reinforced for so long. For the person living alone, this day feels manageable. They handle things the way they always have. They don't want to escalate anything unnecessarily. They conserve effort. They assume tomorrow will offer another chance if something needs addressing. There's no clear reason to ask for help today, and asking for help always feels heavier now than it used to. So today passes without interruption, and that passing feels neutral. What makes this moment so deceptive is that it feels like proof that the system still works. Everyone involved ends the day thinking, nothing happened. But nothing is no longer a harmless outcome. Nothing now means that time has advanced without relief. It means the narrow margin has narrowed further. It means the opportunity for early correction didn't just close, it moved further out of reach. This is where later reflections become especially painful. People will look back and say, that day seemed fine. And they'll be right. It was fine. That's the problem. Fine is no longer safe when there's no buffer left. Fine allows patterns to continue uninterrupted. Fine lets everyone believe they're still ahead of the situation, even as they fall further behind it. By this point, the system doesn't need neglect to fail. It only needs continuity. The same routines. The same assumptions. The same waiting. Everything that once made the system humane and respectful now quietly works against it. And because nothing unusual happens, no one thinks to intervene differently. This is the day that later feels unbearable to remember, not because something went wrong, but because nothing did. No one can point to a mistake. No one can identify a clear turning point. There's just the knowledge that if something had happened, anything that forced interruption, it might have changed what came next. From here on, the system is no longer drifting. It's committed. And commitment, once made without noticing, is very hard to reverse. At some point, silence changes its weight. It doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't interrupt the day. It simply sits there, heavier than usual, harder to dismiss. The absence of a message that normally comes. The delay that stretches past what feels comfortable. No single moment demands action, but together they create a pressure that can't be reasoned away as easily as before. Silence is no longer neutral. It has started to mean something. This is where instinct finally pushes back. Someone notices the quiet and feels that old unease, the one that used to be dismissed by patience. This time, it doesn't fully settle. The mind still offers explanations, but they don't quite satisfy. They sound thinner. The confidence that waiting is respectful starts to crack, just enough to let concern in. Not panic. Just the realization that calm may no longer be telling the truth. For the person living alone, this is when effort stops matching outcome entirely. Small tasks take more out of them. Recovery lags. The day requires more deliberate pacing. They may consider reaching out, then hesitate, not because they don't want help, but because they've learned how much it takes to create response now. Silence on their side isn't meant as a signal. It's simply the result of managing within narrowed limits. But from the outside, that same silence begins to look different. This is where interpretation becomes dangerous. People begin reading meaning into gaps. They replay recent interactions. They wonder if they missed something. Concern sharpens, but it arrives tangled with uncertainty. They don't know whether they're late or early. Whether they're overreacting or finally reacting appropriately. The system hesitates here, not because it lacks care, but because it no longer trusts its own timing. Action, when it comes, feels different now. It's firmer. Less polite. Less willing to wait. And that shift itself feels unsettling, because it breaks the tone that has governed everything so far. Reaching out now carries weight. It signals that something has crossed from acceptable delay into uncomfortable absence. Even before anyone knows what's wrong, the atmosphere has changed. What makes this moment especially heavy is the recognition that silence is no longer something to respect, it's something to interrupt. That realization doesn't feel like relief. It feels like regret. Regret that the signal had to get this strong. Regret that earlier quiet moments were treated as harmless. Regret that patience may have outlasted its usefulness. Nothing here guarantees a bad outcome. There is still time for response. Still room for care. But the cost of delay is no longer abstract. It's felt in the urgency of voices, in the speed of decisions, in the way people move from observation to action without the comfort of certainty. Silence has stopped meaning fine. And once silence changes its meaning, everything that follows carries consequence. When everything finally becomes clear, it doesn't feel like revelation. It feels like alignment, the moment when scattered observations quietly lock into place. People don't say, "We didn't care." They say, "We thought we had more time." And that belief explains almost everything. Care was present. Attention existed. What was missing was urgency calibrated early enough to matter. Looking back, the pattern feels painfully obvious. Calm trained waiting. Waiting narrowed the margin. Narrowed margin changed what effort could accomplish. And by the time action felt necessary, it could no longer do the work that early interruption would have done. No one chose this outcome. It formed out of reasonable decisions made inside a system that kept rewarding patience long after patience stopped being protective. This is often the point where a small detail becomes unbearable in memory. Not a crisis, something quieter. A message that ended with, "Talk tomorrow." A call that wasn't returned until morning. A day that felt fine because nothing unusual happened. These moments replay not because they were wrong at the time, but because they look different once the pattern is visible. Ordinary kindness, seen too late, carries a weight it was never meant to hold. For the person who lived alone, the story is not one of silence or pride. It's a story of adaptation. They adjusted to what the system seemed to expect. They learned when to speak and when to manage quietly. They conserved effort where response felt delayed. Their restraint wasn't a failure to ask for help, it was a response to how help had begun to arrive. By the end, even they may not recognize how much they carried without interruption. What people wish they had understood earlier is simple and difficult to accept. Stability can be misleading. The absence of crisis doesn't mean the absence of risk. Calm systems can drift into danger precisely because they look humane and functional. Waiting, when repeated often enough, doesn't stay neutral. It becomes a force that shapes outcomes, quietly, patiently, without ever raising its voice. This understanding doesn't arrive with blame. It arrives with a quieter ache. The realization that doing everything kindly and reasonably doesn't always prevent loss, it sometimes delays recognition until recognition costs more than it should. That truth is uncomfortable because it challenges the belief that good intentions naturally produce good timing. What remains afterward isn't just grief, but awareness. A different relationship with silence. A sensitivity to delays that once felt harmless. An understanding that early interruption is not disrespect, it's protection. That reaching sooner isn't panic, it's care that understands how margins work. If there is hope here, it isn't abstract. It lives in the next quiet moment that feels slightly too quiet. The next pause that lasts a little longer than expected. The next time waiting feels polite, and something inside suggests otherwise. Because the most important moments rarely announce themselves as important. They feel reasonable. They look calm. And once you understand what waiting can quietly take away, you don't hear silence the same way again.